In my big dream imagining, we get to distill the deepest stories and the truths that come out of community and out of history. When we have our voices heard and have our messages heard, we become leaders. Ietsap uweliel siyaya siem siyalakwa antha Jada-Gabrielle Pape antha WuWas. This is the Drawing Wisdom video podcast. This is our 6th episode in season 2. And today I'm going to be in conversation with my co-conspirators Kat Dodds and David Ng. And we're wrapping up season 2, and we are here in the unceded and occupied homelands of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh people and their ancestors. So join us. Iachawhile, David. Iachawhile, Kat. It's nice to see you both.
Hello.
It's nice to see you too.
Nice to see you too.
As we're diving into today's conversation, I want to jump right in by saying tomorrow is June 21st. It is the summer solstice. It is the longest day of the year. It has historically, for thousands of years, been ceremony day for so many Indigenous people across Turtle Island. And then the Gov co-opted the day and made it, I think it was National Aboriginal Peoples Day. What is it now called?
Indigenous Peoples Day.
Indigenous Peoples Day, which is, I feel Indigenous every day, but okay. And I just wanted to see, are either of you doing anything special or different than your usual days for June 21st?
Often we end up getting up at the solstice moment and going and having a picnic, but I don't know if we've planned that this year. I should talk to Zahid and see. To be honest, the date of June 21st seems a bit shocking that it's tomorrow. I've just been so... My sense of time has changed in the last few weeks.
Yeah.
Right, because you had COVID.
Yeah. Normally we get up and have a first light of day picnic somewhere as a way of kind of marking the shift. Perhaps I will reinstitute that.
Yeah. Put ceremony back in.
So this week is a pretty big week. I've been working on a project called Cultivating Kin, where we're trying to rethink or reimagine how a decolonial art system might look like. And so it's culminating into this weekend. It's Thursday to Sundays, basically, or that's what I'll be doing. So nothing tomorrow, but yeah, focusing on the weekend.
So I'm just going to tell you what I hear in this, and that is that... as two of my closest friends and closest colleagues and my co-conspirators, and as people who are really committed to working alongside Indigenous peoples, this day, this year, isn't registering the same as it has historically. I wonder if that's in part by the pandemic, like things look differently. But I also wonder if there is something about that's shifting where we're putting more, because I know for me, I don't have as many plans as I often do. I often go and I put down tobacco either at the water or up on the side of a mountain and go for a walk and try and bring back ceremony into that day. And then I like to just go to some event or another, because then I can bump into lots of people who I love and who I don't get to see all at once. And I think we're more diligent now. We're sort of like putting our heads down and doing the work in a different way. And I wonder if there's just a flavor that's different, that the world is changing.
Well, they made it an official holiday, which it didn't used to be. And in a weird way, that was like the way people treat holidays is not a day to do ceremony, but a day to sleep in and not, which isn't what I'm thinking of it as, but it kind of changes the tenor a bit. It's kind of odd.
Yeah, and I don't think that's the government's role to decide which day works, like to remove the day that we as Indigenous people, like that, we should get to decide that. And I know I know you both know this, but I'll just say it because we're recording. I know that I am not alone in these sentiments, but also I'm not speaking on behalf of Indigenous people, because I know lots of Indigenous people who would disagree with me vehemently, still get along with me, but totally disagree with my point.
Yeah, well, I know there's been groups that have lobbied to make it an official holiday, because before it was a day, but it wasn't an official holiday. And no, I have usually gone to some kind of event if there's been one too, but there's been, like, they haven't been doing that during the pandemic. Like, the thing at Trout Lake hasn't been happening. I think there's something happening at Carnegie Center tomorrow around noon. I was just looking at that on Facebook.
And this is sort of, I'm steering the conversation a little bit differently, but I'm just reflecting on other conversations that have happened around, especially when the government also named it a holiday. What does this symbol from the government do? Like, are they co-opting? Now, are they saying that reconciliation has been achieved because now we've made this day a holiday, right? Yeah, so this sort of really interrogation of, like, okay, what is actually happening? Like, have there been, like, actual material shifts towards that type of recognition of the horrible things that have happened to Indigenous people in this place?
And actually taking over that September 30th date, which was a grassroots, Indigenous created Orange Shirt Day event, and then making that the day that they slapped on their official government piece to. I thought that was, again, not behind the scenes. Maybe that was something the organizers of Orange Shirt Day wanted. But I can say the thing is, Orange Shirt Day started very grassroots. Phyllis Webstat started it. It got picked up by a lot of people because they felt an affinity for it. And it became a day without the government saying so. Right? And then they took that day and made it their quote unquote National Day of Reconciliation, which seems, it didn't rub me the right way, actually, when I heard that.
I think there's June 21st, the Indigenous Peoples Day. There's September 30th, Orange Shirt Day. And then there's the email signatures of whose territory you live, laugh, love, work, play, whatever on.
Where did that come from? Where did the live, laugh, love, work, play thing come from?
Like self-help, one of those things on a pillowcase in some shop. I don't know. Yeah. Like it's on mugs and cups and T-shirts
what makes me laugh though is, like, you know, when people say live, I live, dance, play on the unceded territory. You know, like, I'm gonna dance upon the colonialism. You know, like it's actually like this. I mean, this goes to our conversation of land back too.
Yes,
it's like what you're saying. Like the intention behind that land acknowledgement should be land back, not I'm dancing upon. You know, like the.
Well, this is the thing: is all of the things that we're talking about today. There are no actions that go along that coincide with any of it, and so. Isn't that the epitome of tokenization? And what are people doing on these days besides it's a stat holiday, I'm taking the day off. So many businesses that, last year for the first September 30th, like the official day, so many businesses were closed, but they didn't do anything. There were no reparations that their business was doing. There were no changes or modifications. It was just really a day off.
Mm-hmm. And I bet you some of them were selling a lot of merch too around it.
I think that's really true. That, one of the things that happens, sorry, that's my dog in the background.
The dogs that you see in the beautiful B-roll.
That's right. That one's Silly Sylvia that you can hear. She's very vocal. But one of the things that happens with Indigenous people, like everything has been removed from us over time, right? Like our children have been removed, our languages have been removed, our homelands have been removed. And, we could also shift the language from removed to just stolen or taken, or, genocide is ongoing. And so when we start to capitalize on Orange Shirt Day or, June 21st, or when we start to, when non-Indigenous Canadians, when Canadians start to capitalize on that, it's just another level of theft and of genocide and of colonialism. And it's actually really violent if people don't make a decision to do something different. And I think people, Canadians listening to this might be actually thinking, okay, so tell us, what do you want us to do? And which is really problematic also, because I think what we know, when there is something that is unjust, we know how to do the right thing, but we choose not to and we hide behind confusion. And we say, well, I don't know what to do. And so that's where the ongoing learning is, and that's where the implementation of action has to follow.
Yeah. And I mean, it's pretty, I agree with you, Jada. I mean, it's also really sad when you continue to hear like what are we to do when there's literally like 97 calls. There's literally a PDF document, that you can easily find as a good starting place to do your own work.
So there's one prescriptive thing. Read the 97 calls to action. If you don't know what to do, read that and then do something.
Yeah. But there aren't just the Truth and Reconciliation Commission final reports. It's not just those calls to action. There are so many reports, and those reports are not they're not sort of like pulled out of the air. They are the work of many, many, many people sharing their stories, and then the analysis that goes along with that, and the support systems who uphold those people. And so the real honoring of all of those people who did that work to come in and share their stories, I think that is where we start to, decide I will not just read these, but I will follow them and implement them in my home. I will put pressure on the government to implement them, because I think, 3 of the 94 calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission have been implemented. Like, that's not okay. And so since we last saw each other, since we last visited, I went away to the Huichol people's territory in Nayarit in Mexico. And one of the things that traveling away from our home territory allows me is to see something that it echoes what I experience here as a Huamoch Mestayuch, but there's something very different about the flavor of colonialism in Mexico. And one of the things that really strikes me when we start to normalize how things look on a day-to-day basis. So when I was, out in the village in Nayarit, one of the things that we see is that there's lots and lots of Mexican people and indigenous Mexican people and indigenous peoples, and they're not holding they don't own businesses. White Americans and white Canadians own these businesses, and then have indigenous peoples or Mexican, usually it's Mexican people and not indigenous people actually, who are working for them. And so there's this real imbalance of the flavor of how things look. And it's so stark and different because I don't know the players in the same way as I do when I'm here, but it's actually the same mechanisms that have that happening here. But it's so normalized here that we don't see indigenous people as leading the way when we're in Canada, and that we hold these really low tier positions in hierarchical organizations, and we're not in positions of decision making or of power. And how is that? How have we decided that that is acceptable? And maybe that's something that Canadians can do is say, oh, so in order for Indigenous people to take the lead, I actually need to be quiet and step back, and I need to just listen. And that's not something I see in organizations or in mainstream culture at all.
I'm just thinking what we were just talking about, what we quickly kind of talked about, like tokenistic gestures of like representation, but also recognizing that, you know, just hearing what you're saying, Jada, that, you know, that type of a lived experience of Indigenous people, there's a knowledge, expertise there that, you know, that is only held by someone with that lived experience, and that is a very valuable part of a decision making, and, you know, connected to what we're talking about around yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and rightfully, like with all of the exposures of things we've known all along, but many reports have come out that have just sort of either documented racism, systemic racism, or systemic lack of access in media, systemic lack of like those in power. And there's been a kind of movement over the last few years of more inclusion, quote unquote, but there's still been this resistance to people with power giving up power and giving it to other people that have been marginalized up until now. Whereupon there's kind of like, oh yes, we can have more visibility and inclusion and, you know, more people, but is there actually, and the term that I used in the context of this too was, there's still an economic inequity when you look at who's holding the power to really advance the stories and the careers and the, you know, the lives of people of color in these institutions, right? Like, as long as the heads of the institutions are still majority, and they still are majority white and still majority white men, maybe there's a little less all male, but it's still pretty much that way at the top levels everywhere. So that won't change anything in terms of, like, the lived experience won't get a chance to make systemic change if it's still in positions that don't dictate policy or don't dictate the bigger picture way in which institutions run.
And when we even use like the language of inclusivity, when we talk about, you know, it might be called an inclusive place, but is it actually accessible? Like, can we actually get in there to be included? And then there's this thing, and David, I'm sure you've experienced this too, but we have to shapeshift a little bit, like contort and downplay who we are, make ourselves palatable in order to be included. And so therefore, are we really being included, or are we contorting to fit? And yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, you know, Jada, you do work in this area, but I just, you know, when you're talking about inclusion, if the system is, I'm just thinking, if the system is a white supremacist system, and you're performing quite literally inclusion into that system and not changing the structure, you're really sort of, I think, what do they call it again? There's a term for it, but when these people of color, when they're given these sorts of affirmative action policies, are really set up to fail, right? Because that structure and system is not built for them. And it's actually built to exclude them. But now you're performing this EDI or JEDI program to make sure that those people are placed in those places, but then they're always set up for burnout and failure, right? And so it's sort of, I'm just thinking about those sort of structural systemic things that need to change, even I would say more so than just the bringing people in, you know, based on affirmative action, which is important to do.
Yeah. This idea of assimilation being expected. And so even if someone does, within that system, even if someone does achieve that top level position, if they've had to assimilate to get that top level position, then their lived experience still doesn't have a chance to change the paradigm. And I remember that when I first, it was quite a long time ago before these conversations were fashionable, but I had a friend who was a gaming designer. Like he worked in, and he was talking, he was a programmer, but he was talking about how these games get designed. And they get designed with story groups, but those story groups have the kind of leaders who set the paradigms that the story groups work under. And so, well, there's been for a long time a movement to have more women and more, minorities included in these gaming design stuff. That conversation's been going on. But he said, unless you're the one setting the paradigm, it makes no difference. It makes literally no difference other than graphics on screen. Like representation is all you get, nothing more. And I think representation without actual deeper change, like influence, is actually harmful. Possibly, I don't know. I mean, I can't speak for every situation, but yeah, that idea that even in the context of games, which you think about are creating immersive worlds with their logics, there's an actual role for someone to set the paradigm. And that's the only one with any real power.
Well, and I do think it's harmful. And the first thing that strikes me that would be harmful is that we can, if we have representation, but we don't have a shift in narrative, like in how the story is told, how the story is heard, and so then there's no agency. And so what's harmful is then organizations or companies or whatever can say, we've done this. Look, you can see this on the screen, or you can see these people working at the front desk. And so therefore we are inclusive, therefore we are diverse. But then we don't feel that when we use the product or when we are part of the organization, that we have, then actually that's the most harmful sort of tokenism there is.
It's like assimilation represented.
Yeah. When I was traveling, when I went away with my kid, one of the things that strikes me so in the foreground is that when you're traveling with a 17-year-old, they tell stories different. They see the world different, right? Because they're not our age or our ages. And so it's my job to sort of make some space for that and not just assume that my one way of having a conversation is the right way or the correct way. And it doesn't come naturally. Like it takes work, but there has to be room for everybody in those conversations. And that's within a family. So if we have that kind of diverse storytelling and story listening in a family, shouldn't we have that within organizations and social groups and communities as well? And so when we're doing things like podcasts, isn't there 50 million ways to tell a story? And that's the real diversity. And so we have to actually work those muscles at listening to stories that are not just familiar to us and that are not just comfortable. And I think that for me as a Huelmoch Mistayach, that's one of the fundamental things, is that the stories we tell are different. We were in conversation the other day for the podcast with Auntie Allen. Auntie Allen has a very distinct way of telling a story, and it's very distinct to their people, to their family, to their community, and to their experience. And if we don't make room for that, how are we being allies at all? Like if we just dictate what that's going to look like. And actually, the transformative quality of sitting in conversation with somebody like Auntie Allen, and the transformative quality of being able to hear those stories and recognize not just the relevance, but the importance. I think that's their daily gift to the world, right? That's a truly generous spirit.
One of the things that I really enjoyed about that episode, or that's stuck with me with that episode, was when Alan was talking about something around language and gender. Yeah, when they were so they explored a little bit more deeper into the language and actually saw traditions that were actually outside of that binary, and it made me think about, like, we were just talking about Chinatown. A cat lives in Chinatown Value Co-op. I'm part of. We have a studio in Chinatown, and it's making me also think about. We just had a conversation on sort of some of the generational encounters that we've had, and I'm thinking particularly around some of the traditions that we've sort of encountered where there's a lot of gendered impositions. Like I'm thinking about the lion dance in Vancouver. It's primarily only taught to male assigned at birth folks, and they don't teach it to women. Most places don't teach it to women, and I'm just thinking about some of my friend Callum Ng, who is really starting to revisit that as well, and to teach that tradition to people of all genders and ages and abilities. But yeah, it was just making me think about like this, instead of a lot of the people that hold these line dance practices, for example, they say it's traditionally only taught to men, but that's just not the case, right? It was this kind of patriarchal tradition that just somehow became a thing that took shape here, but it doesn't have to be that way.
There's something about weaponizing the word tradition.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, to be excluding of people. And I think all cultures around the world thrive and survive when they are inclusive, not exclusive. And I mean inclusive of all of their own, right? Of all of the many ways of being, and the many ways of being. We are not one way. But colonialism around the world has had a massive impact on seeing that there is one way to be, and it's all the things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's just it. The status quo anywhere really just serves those in power and never serves those who don't want to assimilate, whatever the status quo may be, right? That kind of. So I think things that are really resilient, cultures that are really resilient, are more diverse within their own understanding of even what's part of one culture.
Mm-hmm. You know, as we've done this podcast over the last season 1 and season 2, there's one thing that really stands out for me with every single person we've sat with and visited with, and that is that when we are in conversation with Indigenous people, one of the threads, one of the commonalities that makes my heart feel really good is that we work for the betterment of our people. We don't go out and, do one thing for one person. We really do things for the next 7 generations and for the generations past. And it's a very stark difference between dominant culture, who really often we work for the betterment of myself and my family, or my street or my house, and not for my people, my community, and what's a larger picture. And so much of the work that Indigenous peoples are doing is a real celebration of resilience, and somehow we remain robust enough to keep doing it. And actually what I think that is because we're really tied to each other, and that we don't get, we get very bogged down in the injuries, but also there's real hope in working alongside each other. I hope we get to do season 3. I think there are so many more of these conversations to uphold and to showcase with the beautiful work that people are doing, and the very good ways that people are doing it. Like it strikes me in conversation with Danette that the work that Danette does is really bring forward good medicine to create starting like a really healthy, robust starting place for birthing mothers and families. And I think if we can start to, we start with that level of care, and we set up someone for a good life, and to know here's a beginning place, and then we carry it through at every stage, right? And I think that's one of the real gifts of this podcast, is to be able to just slow down, sit in the conversations, and bear witness to the really moving and powerful and impactful work that people are doing. And I love these conversations, and I'm also really struck that they're very short conversations. And when I'm in real life, in conversations with people, they typically last like 6 hours or something. And these are limited to these small windows of time, but also how lucky that we get to do this.
Yeah, and I would also say, they're tough conversations too, right? They're not, and they're things that we're moving through together as friends, and also I think being vulnerable and trusting with each other, that we can have these conversations. So that's what's been really, I think, has felt really good for me, that we've been able to get into really, tough territory and have that conversation, because these are the conversations I think we need to continue.
Yeah, I think that's really true. I think the courage that it takes to say, sure, I'll be soft, I'll be vulnerable, I'm willing to change. How can I be changed by this? And not coming in with like, I know everything, I'm right. Yeah.
Yeah, just being able to be in the backgrounds of all the filming that we did with the one-on-one conversations for me was really enlightening, because I heard it happening, the conversation in the background, and then I also heard it again in the editing, and it was each time a very rich, almost meditative experience. I think of listening to Shane's over and over again, and it put me in a very relaxed place. Like every time I listened to that conversation, it was very, very grounding. And even though it wasn't my experience he was talking about, it was just his way of speaking, your way of speaking together. It was really lovely. And then Sherry, the conversation with Sherry, it really got me kind of inspired over and over again, which happens every time I end up interacting with Sherry. I find her very inspiring. I find her sort of gentle and generous insight into this two worlds thing too, which is probably for non-Indigenous people like myself kind of a very accessible way to think, because we've been learning from others' lived experience, but we're always going to be in two worlds if we want to enter anyone else's world, right? That's always going to be the case. We never have the option we have the option of retracting and being closed, but if you want to be open, it's going to be, you have to live in more than one world. And so she just makes that so gracious, I guess, and generous, the way that was presented. And then it was with Danette. It's so exciting to think about this idea of revolutionizing this birth experience in a way that, we've gone through this in the past with even sort of feminism and women's empowerment. This is such a layered and deeper level of all of that. So that was incredible. And then Alan, they were also just so much richness of thought in all of what they said, in such simple ways to express it, but very deep in terms of those things. So, I didn't mean to actually sit here planning a recap of everything, but I'm just thinking how inspiring I did find all of that more than once. And hopefully the listeners of this podcast will experience some of that. Just let it wash over you. Don't necessarily have to quote unquote learn anything. It's like just hear something. That's the goal.
Yeah, as you describe our guests and our friends and my kin, I really, part of my experience of having these people in my lives in my life on a consistent basis is that I am carry them around like they're part of my medicine bundle, and these conversations, I reflect on them and I keep learning from them and I keep visiting them, not like I'm listening to the podcast over and over, but that I just, these offerings are so abundant in each conversation, but it really requires, like you say, Kat, to be in another world, to listen a different way. And so not listening for what can I get, but actually just softening and listening. And then there's so much there. And it's a very untrained way to be. We don't train that in school, in formal education. We don't train that in dominant culture, and so it's like walking along the water's edge and just being and softening, and all these things change with every time a wave comes in or out, right? And I think often I'm so lucky. Imagine I'm so lucky to have been born Hualmoch. Like, I'm so lucky, and I'm so lucky I get to be involved in so many of my communities, and that I get to do this work in this way just feels like such a gift. And so I'm really glad we get to do this work and share it with other people who can hopefully soften and learn and make decisions to do something with, to be reciprocal in their relationships with Indigenous peoples. That being said, I guess we're wrapping up Season 2 of the Drawing Wisdom video podcast. And if we do Season 3, yay, I'll see you here just like this. And if we don't do Season 3, I'll see you on all of our other good projects. And
I think there'll be a Season 3.
Yeah, I think so too. And take really good, gentle care, both of you, and to all of our listeners, thank you for joining us, and take very good, gentle care of yourselves too. And we'll see you all again soon. Hayakwa.